Where do I go to get the best turbo cam for my combination or the best turbo intake for my combination? The reality is the ideal person to decide what the best turbo cam is or turbo intake is for your combination is you, but you're asking the wrong question. I'm going to show you the right one. So how do we pick the best turbo cam for our LS or the best turbo intake for our LS? Well, we start by asking the right question. And the right question is, what do I want my power curve to look like? Where do I want my motor to make power? You see, on a typical junkyard 5.3 with a 1,000 horsepower turbo, you can add a cam that makes peak power at 5,000 RPM or 6,000 RPM or 7,000 RPM. All three of those will have different power curves. Now, who's the best person to pick the best power curve for their combination? That's you. Same thing with intake manifolds. Working with the camshaft, the intake decides where your combination is going to make power. And again, the best person to choose the shape of that curve is you. Let's check it out.
Before we jump into our discussion on the very best turbo cam and the very best turbo intake manifold, we need to understand something very important. And I've covered this before in other videos, so if you haven't seen it, check the video out. It's right here. But basically what it says is that when you run an NA combination, when you add boost to it, if you add a consistent amount of boost, nothing changes on the power curve. The power curve is exactly the same. So when we add boost, this is a 5.3 liter. This one happened to have a Trailblazer SS intake manifold on it. But when we add boost to this, if we add a consistent amount of boost, this one actually had a slightly rising boost curve. But as you can see, basically the shape of the curve is the same. And if we add a consistent amount of boost, nothing changes because nothing's changed in the cam timing, nothing's changed in the intake manifold runner length, nothing's changed in the cylinder head. It's all the same. It's just under pressure. So everything acts exactly the same. So whatever the shape of the power curve is that you have NA, that's going to be the shape of your power curve if you have a consistent amount of boost. So now let's get to finding out what is the best turbo cam for your application. Okay, here is a pop quiz I want you to answer in the comments. Here are three different camshafts. We have a stock LM7 cam, we have an LS9 cam in red, and then the Crane 224 cam in green. This is all from the test that I ran on all of the factory camshafts. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. It's right here, lots of good information. Tell you which one of the camshafts work well on a stock combination. So these are the three different power curves. So here's my question, here's the quiz. If we have a 1,000 horsepower turbo, a 7875 Gen 2 from VS or an S475 or an S480 size turbo, which one of these will make 1,000 horsepower? Go ahead and answer. I'll wait. Hopefully some of you guys are picking the highest power output, the Crane cam. Some of you are going, yeah, but I've done that with an LS9. Other guys are going, well, I would kind of like to do that with the stock LM7 camshaft. And the reality is that the answer is all of them will make 1,000 horsepower. If you have a turbo that will support 1,000 horsepower, every one of these combinations will make 1,000 horsepower. They're just going to do it at different boost levels. And yeah, I know, I'm sure people will comment, and I want you to make the comment, yeah, but it'd be harder for the stock cam to make that power because you'd have to run it at a lot more boost. And yes, you would, and it would change the position on the compressor map. The back pressure might be different. There are things that we have to consider here. But the reality is if we limit our combination with the 1,000 horsepower turbo, which is what most people use, all of these cams will make 1,000 horsepower. It would just take a lot more boost with the stock cam. In fact, with the stock cam, it will take about 27 pounds of boost to get to 1,000 horsepower. With the Crane cam, it will only take about 18 pounds of boost. And so there obviously might be a difference in charge temperature, yada, 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 and all that stuff. But with a 1,000 horsepower turbo, all of these will do that. So the question then becomes, okay, if I can make 1,000 horsepower with all of these camshafts, and in fact, if we went up in cam timing to, let's say, the maximum, the biggest cam that we could fit in the available piston to valve clearance of our stock junkyard kind of motor, which all of us use. So if we put the biggest cam that will fit with the available piston to valve clearance, that cam will work too, and it would also make 1,000 horsepower with our 1,000 horsepower turbo. So the question now is, which one of these is the best turbo cam? And that's the question I always get asked. And here is your answer right here. I actually can't answer that question. Neither can the guys from Comp or BTR, Texas Speed, or Cam Motion, or any of the guys. The reality is the best person to answer that 1,000 horsepower question, what cam works best, what cam works best for my combination, when I say my, I mean yours, you're the guy that can answer that. And you can look at this graph and not decide, because you're not deciding which one makes 1,000 horsepower. They all do. They just do it at different boost levels. So now we need to redirect our focus or redirect our question. You guys do. The question now isn't which one can make 1,000 horsepower. They all can. The question is, how do I want to make 1,000 horsepower? What works best for my combination? You get to answer that. Which one of these do you want? Because that's what you're choosing. You're not choosing which one makes 1,000 horsepower. They all do. You're choosing, how do I want my combination to make 1,000 horsepower? I'll give you an example. With the stock cam, works, takes a lot of boost. It's not going to be the most efficient, but it can get there. So do you want, and you're looking at other things when you're choosing a camshaft, do you want stock idle and stock drivability? And in this case, if you look at the comparison down at 2,500 RPM, do you want more drivability down there and potentially more boost response? And this is certainly the case. The bigger the turbo that we choose, the more important that low speed torque is going to be. Because what makes turbo response is the size of the turbo relative to the power output, especially down low, of the test motor. So if we make more power NA, we are going to have more turbo response. It becomes less and less important as we put a smaller, like if we put a turbo on here that's a 600 horsepower turbo, that response question becomes less important or less critical, or the torque production down low becomes less critical, because they all make enough torque to already like get that turbo spooled up. If you size the turbo so all of them will turbo, like for instance, if we have a turbo that will spool up with 300 foot-pounds of torque, they all do that. So one of them isn't going to be more responsive than the other. Maybe at part throttle stuff, you guys can argue about that. But the reality is that turbo sizing becomes, or the response rate is less critical on a smaller turbo. So if we have a big turbo, this becomes more important. So do you want that curve? Do you want the stock power curve that makes peak power at about 5,200 and then falls off? Obviously, you can change this with a rising boost curve a little bit, but that's going to be what happens when you choose that camshaft. You guys can decide that. Do you want that power curve? And only you can decide that. We can't decide that. I can't tell you which one's best. The guys from all of the cam companies can't tell you that. You have to decide that for yourself. That's why I'm saying you can pick what works best for your combination. Do you like the LS9 cam? Again, you're considering other things. LS9 cams are cheap. Guys have taken them out and upgraded them so you can buy them cheap. It works well. It makes a lot of peak power, but there's a trade-off. If you look down here below 4,500 RPM, that LS9 cam makes less power than the LM7 cam does. There's no amount of, oh, I'm going to run extra timing to try to make that up. That doesn't happen. These two combinations, the LM7 and the LS9 cam, those are optimized power curves. Both of them have the right amount of timing to maximize the power output of each one down there. That LS9 cam can't make any more power than that, even with more timing. We know because we tried. We also adjusted the airfield. This is what they make, and it's just a function of the difference in cam timing. The LS9 is softer down low compared to the LM7. It makes more power at the top, a lot more power at the top. So it will make the same 1,000 horsepower or whatever boost level you want to run it at. It will make more power at the top at a lower boost level. So do you want that curve? I can't decide that. The cam companies can't decide that. Only you can decide that. The Crane 224 cam or any other cam that makes more power, do you like that curve? That's a good combination in my opinion. It makes as much power as the stock LM7 cam, which we know works fairly well down low, even down to 2,900 RPM. It's softer down low than the stock cam because it's bigger. But if you size your turbo to where, as I said, where that's not a concern, this cam works well. It also makes more power than either the LS9 or the LM7. But again, you can get to 1,000 horsepower with any of these cams. So you're going to be deciding how best I want to get there. Do I want to have a cam that makes peak power at 6,200 or 6,500 or 6,600? And this will also become important when we talk about intake manifolds. Or do I want one that makes peak power at 52 or 5,300? That's up to you. None of these cams are the ideal or best turbo cam. You're not picking that. You need to think about it differently. Pick the power curve that you want from your camshaft, then add boost. Let's talk about the intake manifolds. Okay, before we get to our discussion on you picking the best turbo intake manifold, I want to do a quick refresher course, and this is from another video that I have up already. If you haven't seen this, this is a comparison between a long runner LS6 intake and the short runner sniper style intake manifold. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. It's right here. But here's what happened, and we ran this motor both NA and turbocharged because I wanted to show you it does the same thing under boost. So here's our LS6 intake manifold on our cammed 5.3 liter. Here's what happened when we put the short runner intake manifold on there. NA, you can see it made more power past 6,000 RPM. It's a short runner, high RPM intake manifold, and the factory LS6 is a long runner manifold, so it makes more torque and more power all the way up past 6,000 RPM. So here's what happened when we ran these two under boost. Here is our turbocharged LS6 intake manifold, and here's our turbocharged short runner intake. And you can see it did the same thing. The LS6 and the gains are actually multiplied under boost. If you can have a consistent boost curve, this is what happens. The manifolds do the same thing. So when it was boosted, we saw the same thing. The long runner manifold makes more power all the way up to 6,000 or more. The short runner makes more power after that. So now we're going to talk about choosing the right turbo intake manifold. The camshaft isn't the only component that's misunderstood as we apply boost to it. The intake manifold also seems to be a concern for a lot of people. And here's what I can tell you, that much like the camshaft, intake manifolds are RPM dependent. They're going to help dictate where the combination makes power. So if you have a truck intake, it's going to want to make power at a different RPM range than if you have a short runner intake manifold like we showed you before, with a comparison between the sniper style intake manifold and the LS6 manifold. The long runners in the manifold are going to optimize power production in a lower RPM range. And I use the term low, low and high like arbitrarily, because where they make power is going to be determined by the runner length. And if we're talking about something that's like 6,500 RPM and less, think about the long runner manifold. If it's going to be above that, you need to start thinking about changing the runner length in the intake manifold, whether it's boosted or NA, and I'm going to show you that right now. So this is a 6-liter motor, the one that I ran the big intake shootout for Hot Rod. I also have a video up on that. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. It's right here, where I ran basically every cathedral port intake manifold that I can get my hands on. There's also a video on the LS3, both EFI and carbureted, where I ran all the intake manifolds, so you can see the difference. And the cool thing, just as we saw with the camshafts, all of the testing that I ran NA on these combinations carries over directly to boost. Because, and I get this comment all the time, there is no turbo intake manifold. Intake manifolds do what they do regardless of the presence of boost. So if we have an intake manifold that has an effective operating range that provides you with a power curve that you like NA, it will do that under boost. So when you're picking a manifold, don't pick it based on two things. One, don't pick it based on whether you think it's a turbo manifold or an NA manifold. There isn't a difference between those two. Also, don't pick it on the fact that you think it's a restriction. I'll give you an example. If you go to the wrecking yard and get a 5.3 and bring it back and put a cam in it, now you know how to pick a cam because you're picking it based on the power curve that you want. Pick a camshaft, add boost to it. The intake manifold will not stop you from making power. A truck manifold isn't restrictive, and it won't hurt power on a turbo combination because you think it was a factory manifold and it's only designed to make a certain amount of power. There are guys that make well into mid 4-digit power levels with a truck manifold. So the truck manifold is just going to determine where you make that power, and then the boost will determine basically how much power you make. So if you want to make power in a given RPM range, pick the manifold that does that, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So this is a 6-liter application. It had a cam, it had a good sized camshaft in it. So even with this early truck manifold, we were able to make peak power out at 6,900 RPM on a 6-liter. So with this much camshaft, which we couldn't put in a junkyard motor because this thing had valve release in it, so we could put a good sized camshaft in it. But on a smaller 4.8 liter, you'd make peak power even higher with this camshaft. So you can combine the right cam timing with a long runner truck style intake manifold and make power at a fairly high RPM. And if it's not high enough, you can have a rising boost curve to make it even higher. So there's a lot of RPM range for even a long runner manifold. But this is what happened when we ran the 6-liter with basically the factory truck intake manifold. It made peak power out here at 6,900. It made peak torque here at about 5,000 RPM. And again, this is on a cathedral port application. This one had airflow research cathedral port heads on it. But here's what happened when we put a short runner sniper style intake manifold on. This one was from TSP, I think. It made more peak power. It made peak power out at 7,100 and actually was still climbing because, again, we had a lot of camshaft in this thing. The crossover point for the two was after 6,000 RPM. So below 6,000, the longer runner truck manifold made more power. And this crossover point on a 6-liter will be different than it is on a 4.8 or a 5.3. Actually, the long runner manifold will be a much better choice for even more RPM on the smaller displacement motor. So this crossover point will shift over higher in the RPM range on the smaller motor. But on this combination, the short runner manifold made more peak power and starting at above 6,000 RPM. But here's the question. The question isn't which one of these works better under boost. They do exactly the same thing. The question now is, where do you want your power production? Are you more concerned about power production from 6,000 RPM out, let's say to 7 or 7,500 or 8,000? Or are you more concerned about power production from 3,000 to, in this case, 6,000 or 6,500 RPM? That's what you're picking. Because boost is just going to, as we saw in the previous example, boost is just going to accentuate these differences. You're going to have these effective power curves, just more power. That's what turbos do. So which one of these power curves do you want? You can go in and look at the video that's up on all of these intake manifolds and basically just pick the power curve that you want. This is where I want to make power. This is the one that I like. Now just add boost to that. None of those intake manifolds work better under boost. They do this NA, and they also do this boosted. Here's something I want to show you. These are the two power curves. This is the truck manifold, and this is the TSP, the short runner manifold. But you can also get maybe a different manifold that would give you the combination of both of these. And in this case, we tested the fast, both the LSXR and the LSXRT, and both of them basically produced almost identical power curves, which a lot of guys don't realize. The LSXRT is not a truck manifold. It is the LSXR. It's just bigger. So the fast manifold allowed us to make more power than both of these manifolds, and by a substantial amount. It made more peak power than the TSP, although I think if we continue to run that out higher, the short runner manifold would eventually pass the fast manifold, past 8,000 RPM or past 7,000 RPM or past 7,100 RPM. But out to 7,000 or 7,100, the fast manifold makes more power than both of these. And this, again, would just be exaggerated under boost. So pick the manifold that you want, that makes the power curve that you want, then add boost. And if you're a junkyard guy and you want to go to the junkyard, get a 5.3, put a cam in it and springs in it, and run the truck manifold, don't worry. You won't be restricted. You'll have that power curve. Then you just start adding boost to make the power that you want. And this is especially important if, again, we're limiting ourselves with a 1,000 horsepower turbo. With that stock truck manifold and a 4.8 and a 5.3 and a cam, you can top out the power output of that truck intake manifold and the stock heads. And there's a reason I didn't do heads on this, because we don't need those with a stock or with a 1,000 horsepower turbo. You don't need to upgrade the heads. But on the intake and the cam, there are possibilities there, especially with the camshaft. But we can top out a truck manifold with that 1,000 horsepower turbo. You don't have to change the intake manifold. You can use the truck manifold. It's not restrictive. It just is going to produce a power curve in the effective operating range, and then you're just going to add boost. Let's get to our conclusion.
Okay guys, what'd you think about all the comparisons of the camshafts and the intake manifolds as they relate to turbo combinations? Did this help you out? Did it confuse you more? Let me know in the comments, but here's the takeaway. Produce your NA power curve, the power curve that you want in the RPM range that you want, then add boost. Especially true of a 1,000 horsepower limited combination, since we have an S475 or 7875, S480, whatever it is, in that range, you can make 1,000 horsepower with basically any camshaft. The more power you make NA, the less boost it will require to get to that ceiling, but they'll all do it. Pick the cam that you want, pick the intake that you want, turn the boost up, good things will happen. I'm Richard Holden, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, do all that stuff. Hands are going. I'll keep testing.